Recent worldwide disruption is shaking up the economy and society like a big old earthquake on the Richter scale. The idea that we'll return to normal or establish a new normal is, in a word, ridiculous. Let's have ourselves a pocket sized pep talk because we've undergone a profound change in normal, and that means our new reality requires organizations to think differently. And my guest is here to tell us how.
A Pocket Sized Pep Talk, the podcast that can help energize your business and your life with a quick, inspiring message. Now, here's your host, Rob Jollis.
Today's guest, Alan Weiss, PhD, is a consultant, speaker, and author. Through his consulting firm, Summit Consulting Group, Inc., he's worked with more than 500 leading organizations, including Merck, Hewlett-Packard, GE, Mercedes-Benz, the Federal Reserve, and the New York Times Corporation. He has published, and I'm a little jealous about this, he's published 60 books, many of which have been on the curricula at top business schools. His new book is Sentient Strategy, How to Create Market-Dominating Strategies in Turbulent Economies. And he's here to help bust us out of our prisons of familiarity. Welcome to the show, Alan.
Thanks, Rob. Good to be with you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. And with you, I want to dive right in. You say, and I was reading where you said that future strategy isn't about charts and graphs. It's about beliefs and contributions to customers, the community, employees, and investors. Okay, no argument for me there. But you go on to say, in a time of crisis, innovation is more important than ever. So my question out of the gate is this: can innovation get in the way of not what's right for our customers, but their perception of what's right?
Well, any company that's going to serve customers well has to grow. Because if you're on a plateau, plateaus erode because of the laws of entropy. And the only people I've ever seen coast were going downhill. So organizations to thrive have to grow. And the only way to grow is through innovation. So innovation never gets in the way. It's not always successful. You know, Apple had its Lisa and said that won't work, throw that out. But they just introduced 2 days ago a combination of virtual and real reality, and they're constantly innovating. So if you look at the Dysons and the FedExes and the Apples and these best organizations in the world, they innovate all the time. They have no choice, and they're good at it.
Yeah. And you don't get an argument from me. I'm with you on the corporation. I've run a company for 30 years. I wouldn't have survived 30 if I didn't change. But it's that resistance to change out of the box from the customers that I'm a little concerned about. And you mentioned Apple, so I'll give you an example. I was laughing about it today, but 20 years ago, whatever it was, when I moved to Mac, and it was a big deal for me, I remember kind of whining because you could pull up multiple things on the desktop. And I was used to Windows where you're working in Word, Word's up. You're working in PowerPoint, PowerPoint's up. And here was Apple innovating brilliantly at the time, saying, well, can we do them all at the same time and shuffle them around like cards? I actually remember standing at the Genius Bar complaining about it. So what do you do with customers that resist change?
You're operating on a myth. Customers don't resist change. They love change. That's ridiculous. Employees like change. What they have trouble with sometimes is the journey and how you get there. So companies that don't provide warning, companies that don't provide instruction and so forth, get themselves in trouble. But they snap up the latest Apple, use your own example, the latest Apple product. People snap it up. iPhone 14.5, oh, I only have 14.4. Let me get that. So people love change. We thrive on change, and change is the name of the game. But that's survival of the fittest. That's how we grow. So I think one of the important things that I introduced in Sentient Strategy is that you can't live on and perpetuate myths. And there's too much mythology. For example, strategy should take weeks or months to create, and you should look 15 and 20 years out. That's absolutely absurd.
Okay, well, go on. How far should we look out?
Well, I'll tell you, I've always been a big fan of Peter Drucker, and Peter Drucker invented strategy over at GM in the 50s with Sloan. But just before the pandemic, a year or two before the pandemic struck, I'm saying to myself, that's 70 years old. Enough. That's not the world we live in today. So I created Sentient Strategy, which says that you can create a strategy in a day or two, and you should look no more than 12 months out. You look more than 12 months out, you might as well get an astrologer. Well, what happens? The pandemic hits. People can't go anywhere. They need to do things remotely. And fortunately, I've created a system that you can work perfectly well remotely. And so I've heard of a drug company looking 30 years out. I'd like to have what they're having because they're high. So the point is that a strategy has to be organic. It has to be something that guides the nature and direction of the business. And therefore, it has to be relatively short-term and nimble and agile and changeable. And at the same time, the executive should be able to refer to it easily to create a template by which and through which people make decisions every day, so they're consistent with the strategy. That's my concept. And I use two major axes to do that. One is awareness of the environment in which you operate. And the second is consciousness of the impact of your actions.
Yeah, it's funny. I have to remind myself sometimes I'm on a podcast because I'm sitting here nodding as you're speaking. But I have to tell you, and I want to move off it. I'm still hung up. I'm like in my own little shock world, and you're not a guy who's casual with your opinions of this change of people not fearing change. I'm a sales trainer. I teach audiences how to persuade and influence, and one of the biggest battles we have with many audiences on product is fear of change. Your idea might be better. What if it's worse? I know how to handle the hiccups and the bumps on what I have. And so I'm sort of caught up in that world where that fear of change is prevalent. But you make a really good, strong argument. And
Right.
so I'm sitting, yeah, go ahead.
What you're talking about is not fear of change, it's low self-esteem. There's a world of difference. If you look at the best salespeople, and I'm sure you work with the best salespeople at times, they charge forward. Give me the newest thing and I'll sell it. Give me whatever it is and I'll sell it. I'll position it correctly. But people who aren't confident, people who don't feel a lot of self-worth, they're threatened by change. That's true. But the underlying cause of it is low self-esteem. And sometimes you can't deal with that. Sometimes that's therapeutic.
Okay. All right. I'll let you have that one. Let's keep going. You write about something you refer to as sentient strategy. Let's start with the definition and then move to the key factors it's based upon. So how are you defining that?
Well, sentient strategy simply means self-aware. That's what sentient means.
Yeah.
And if you ask 8 people for a definition of strategy, you'll get 12 answers. So let me give you my definition, but I want to credit where I got it. I spent the first part of my career in Princeton at a firm run by a guy named Ben Trigo, and who's probably as close to a genius as I've ever stood. Passed away about 10 years ago. And Ben's definition of strategy was it's a framework within which we make decisions that set the nature and direction of the business. And to me, that was clear and simple and pure. And that's what I lay down as the rule when I help people set strategy or train people to set strategy. And so my concept is that you pick these strategic factors that will most drive the business to get to your vision of the future in about 12 months. Now, this vision, mission, value mantra that we hear all over the place, I don't agree with. Mission is raison d'etre. That's why we're here. That's why the organization or the endeavor exists. A vision is a metric in the future that says we are or are not fulfilling our mission here on Earth. Simple as that. As for values, we all know the values, act ethically, treat employees well, treat customers well. Come on. It comes out of, page 4 of the accessories catalog. And so I looked at the 2 axes I talked about before, and I set up a system where you pick the 3 or 4 strategic factors that will most drive you toward that future vision. You assess them in terms of what's needed for the current dynamics in business, such as speed and innovation and risk and so on. And then you ask yourself this, which I call the SIR system, SIR. Will these factors sustain us into this new future, this new reality? Do they have to be improved or do they have to be replaced? And then you create the accountabilities, which is missing. The accountabilities are missing in most strategic attempts. By that, I mean, no strategy fails in formulation, strategy fails in implementation. Formulation presents, a nice, beautiful document. And so you have to get accountabilities to bridge that chasm. And that means the executive team has to bear the accountabilities for fulfilling the strategy. And so, in the old days, quote unquote, nobody ever said, hey, you had a great quarter, you didn't meet any of your strategic goals, but we don't care, your numbers are good, right? That's what was said all the time. Nobody said, you had a great quarter, but you didn't meet your strategic goals, so we have to knock you for that. What I'm saying is that if executives don't meet the strategic goals and don't hold people accountable, then nobody will, because there is no backstop to that. Nobody will. So they better do it.
Right. Right. And, I will give you a case study of a company I thought that was ahead of their times that actually did do that. And that was Xerox. Xerox would, I know from being a former Xerox employee, even in sales, we could be 400% of our given plan. But we had certain other elements that were part of our review, such as problem solving or working on quality improvement groups, things that weren't quite as sexy as being 300% of plan. And yet we could be leading the nation in sales and receive what would be a 3 out of 5, a basic C average on a review, because we're not exceeding expectations in all areas. We're exceeding expectations in some areas. And that was at least one corporation's way of saying, we're going to implement the process behaviors that we put in place. And so we want those numbers, we want success, but we're going to measure how you get at that success. And there will be repercussions one way or the other. And Alan, I can tell you from a decade there, that's how companies like Xerox actually did implement quality in the 80s and things like that, because it was a condition of employment. It wasn't if you feel like it. And it worked. It worked well. That was my experience. Now, one other thing we did that I believe relates to what you're saying is when we would problem solve, we would put in what we called real world filters. Now we held those back, but we didn't want that to infringe on our brainstorming. But real world filters, meaning you can come up with great ideas and great thoughts. But at some point we have to apply budget. At some point we have to apply, do we have a realistic shot of moving this through the system? And again, that kept us from using process behaviors strategically to prove points that we're really never going to implement.
Well, the problem is that strategy is what and implementation is how. And so in the strategic process, the way I've written about it in Sentient Strategy is you don't allow hows to interfere with the what. You find a way to get things done. So typically in strategy, somebody says, we don't have budget for that, or we don't have the staff for that, we don't have the repute for that. Stop talking that way. Figure out what you want to become and then work to get there. So I keep, for example, in these strategic sessions, I talk about it in the book, you keep a critical issues list, and somebody comes up with something like, well, we don't have the technology to do that. You say, fine, it's on the critical issues list. We'll talk about that later. Someone will have accountability, but you don't spend 3 hours debating technology. If the strategic outcome is sexy enough, if it's attractive enough, you'll find the way to get the technology. And so you can't put the cart before the horse. What you have to do is you have to focus on the what. And the biggest trouble I've seen in strategy, and this is terrible in nonprofits where I've done a lot of pro bono work, is people keep talking about how and whether they can do things. They should be focusing on what the future should look like.
Agreed. But you keep using we keep using the word strategy. And yet you wrote that strategic planning is an oxymoron, and it made me smile as it's making me smile now. So because guys like me will cling to it, and we're working on strategic planning, we'll strategically that. Why do you say that? How are you coming up with that?
I'll tell you, I'll give you the empirical evidence, and maybe I'll never use that phrase again because it's a terrible oxymoron. Strategy is top down. And so you create strategy and then you assign accountabilities and it cascades down. And remember, I said it's about a framework within which you make decisions at the nature and direction of the business, meaning somebody on the front line, the teller in the bank, the salesperson, can make decisions consistent with strategy. However, planning is bottom up. And so planning looks like this. You mentioned sales before. Let's take sales. The salespeople say, well, we had a good year. They're asking us for an estimate for next year. I could probably do 10% better, but I want to get a bonus and exceed expectations. So I'm not going to put in 10. I'm going to put in 5. I can improve by 5%. Then the sales managers look at that and they say, well, these people are probably overly optimistic. I'm knocking it down to 4. And by the time it goes up through the hierarchy to the executives, it's a 1% increase. And their hands are tied. I mean, what can you do with a 1% increase? So strategic planning is an oxymoron because bottom down and top up make all the difference in the world. And as long as you're going top down and bottom up, make all the difference in the world. So as long as you're going bottom up, which is planning, you're always going to limit the options and the spectrum and the future of the organization. So I hate the term, and I can't stand people who talk about, for example, human resource strategies. That's ridiculous. The organization has a strategy and you do what you can to support it. You don't have a human resources strategy. You don't have a sales strategy. You might have sales tactics, but it's the overarching strategy of the company that has to be met.
Got it. How are you with strategic decision making? You dislike that one too?
No, decision making is a process, and it
Okay,
applies strategically or tactically.
good, good. So that's the one. It's the one I use a great deal when I'm conducting my seminars myself.
You can continue to
Yeah.
use it.
It's funny because that strategic decision making, it's changed the way I deliver a lot of my programs. And obviously I do, as you mentioned, and as I keep mentioning, a lot of sales training. Well, sales training is typically somehow punctuated with a role play. And what that does is actually sucks the life out of the room because they never really understand that, of course, we'll never really go from point A to point B to point C to point D, point E. But for some reason, we're going to simulate that right now. To move to strategic decision making and allow them to look at case studies and basically show me what you need and what you don't need. Show me how you're going to use what you learn. Don't worry about falling into some sort of robotic pattern. Has really kind of ignited the way my audiences are reacting. But a lot of it is just working with it and not worrying about parroting it.
Right, but that's not strategic decision making. That's tactical decision making. Because you mentioned it yourself. How am I going to apply this? Those are tactics.
Well, okay, but they're working off a case study where they have to kind of determine what they're using, but okay, tactical. I'm not changing it, by the way, Alan. But I see your
do what
point.
you want, but you asked me to be your guest, and I can only tell you the honest truth here. The fact is that sales teams are successful based on the tactics they use. And now you can talk about, I mean, you can use any term you want. And if you want to say, look, we need a strategy about the Smith project, about selling to Smith, I understand what you're talking about. But what that will boil down to, the tactics of how Smith is approached and how people are organized and so on. So the important thing to me, and the reason I wrote this book on strategy, which is the second book I've written on strategy, the first one I wrote 30 years ago, and the times have changed entirely, is that we have to recognize, here's what happens. I mean, you know this. If a salesperson doesn't perform, the sales manager will back that up somehow, get a replacement or fill the job himself or herself. There's always a backstop. If the executives don't set strategy correctly, there's no backstop and there is no strategy. That's the critical nature of this beast. And boards aren't looking at this stringently enough.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let's go to the elephant in the room with almost anything we do, which is not just showing people the what or the how or the why, but having them successfully implement whatever it is that we're putting on the table. It's a hot topic for me too. At the end of the day, I'll either work with a customer for 10 years or 10 minutes if they can't implement what it is I'm trying to show them. So let's move there. Why do you think companies struggle with implementation? And it is just a huge piece out there, and they end up blaming the vendor, and maybe we deserve a lot of that blame because we don't provide a strategy. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Poor leadership. I was with a company, and they brought me in, and they said, our employees are not making decisions consistent with our strategy, and we'd like to change that. I said, well, let me see your strategy, and they did. And the strategy was really excellent. It was well written, it was clear, it was concise. So I said to them, I had the executives in the room. I said, what do your employees say when they see this? And they said, oh, we don't show it to them. And so this is just my most egregious example of poor leadership. Right. And a great leader can turn around a poor organization. A poor leader can ruin anything.
Yeah.
So we don't have exactly a surfeit of great leaders. We don't have a surfeit of great statesmen. We have politicians instead. Leadership is a chronic problem over the last couple of decades. Whether you're talking about education or business or sports, it doesn't matter. It's been pretty awful.
And why? Why do you think that? What trap are we falling into there?
Well, it's a combination, in my view, of both arrogance and wealth. And so this country is so wealthy. And I'll admit right now, the wealth isn't always equally distributed, but the fact is this is the wealthiest country in the history of history. People don't feel the need or the urgency or the pressure to find the best, to perform at their best, and they sort of coast, or they accept good enough is good enough, right? And we don't, one of the things I have to help people do is fire people. Managers, leaders, executives, they don't make the tough decisions. And the fact is, when somebody deserves to be fired, they're not performing, they don't have the right attitude, whatever it is, you're doing them a favor too, because they've become a pariah. They've lost their self-worth. Everybody treats them poorly. You need to get them out of the organization. You need to get that toxicity out of the organization. And so it's too easy to throw money at things. I mean, just as an example, I think it was 2 days ago, the LIV and the PGA tours combined in golf.
Yep.
And they were arch enemies, and there was tremendous ill will. And it was simply resolved by throwing tens and hundreds of millions of dollars at the issue. That's not the way to resolve things, and it's not going to produce a better sport. It's going to make a few people wealthy.
Right.
So, and I do agree, by the way, that the ratio of executive pay to average pay in a company is out of whack. But it's not just in companies. You know, the head of the National Teachers Union makes 10 times what the average teacher makes, and the average teacher, in many cases, is close to food stamps. So we haven't really been tough enough with our leadership, and we haven't been tough enough in selecting leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. As a former management trainer, and I didn't do it for too long, but really kind of climbed into that world. It is astonishing how many managers become managers because they were able to wrap up a widget a little bit faster than the person to the right or left, or whatever accomplishment that they had. And I'm not taking it away from them. I'm saying, so, okay, we've got somebody that's excelling. Now, how are we training them to give recognition, to delegate, to do all the tasks that a manager has? And it's rare that I bump into companies that have any formalized programs to teach the people that obviously have a head start. There's a skill, there's a spark, but there's still process behaviors they have to learn. And they're more often unconscious competence, which means they can just as easily be unconsciously incompetent. Yeah.
Let me give you a couple of examples. Many years ago, IBM was trying to reward its researchers, and they'd promote them into management positions where they could make more money, but they were terrible managers. That wasn't their skill, it wasn't their interest.
Right.
So IBM intelligently created something called fellow, senior fellow, and executive fellow, where they would make more and more money remaining as researchers, but not have to manage people. And so they kept their strengths, they made more money. In the educational system today, a lot of teachers go into counseling, and they don't go into counseling because they love counseling or even because they have a great many credentials. It's a way to make more money. Mm-hmm. And so you get a mediocre counselor, and a good teacher leaves the classroom in many cases. So you ruin two jobs. And so you're exactly right. And that is that you have to have the right skills and preparation and support for a leader, but you also have to have someone who wants to be a leader.
Right. That's really is a good point. I might be a classic example. I just thought it was a rite of passage. I thought you do this, and then you become a manager. So I was made a manager at Xerox and miserable. Did not like managing at Xerox. Great company. Loved Xerox. Was a fish out of water. Because, I'm 30 years on my own as a professional speaker. I manage me. I do real well with me. I don't want to manage other people. But Alan, to your point, I never even questioned the path that I was on, because I thought if I don't become a manager, in some way, it indicates that I'm not ambitious or I'm not successful. I wish more people could get that memo a little bit earlier. It's easier later in life.
We've seen recently things like the Great Resignation, and I call that an existential jailbreak.
Right.
People are getting out. People don't leave businesses; they leave people. Excuse me. And I think they leave certain bosses is what's happening, and they get out. We had quietly quitting, and I think we should have quietly firing. As a matter of fact, I think we should reverse that. And what happens is that for the last 2 decades, the literature, the research has been very clear. Money doesn't motivate people. Motivation's intrinsic. I can't motivate someone else. They can motivate themselves. And if you give an unhappy employee more money, you have a wealthier, unhappy employee. What motivates people, what allows people to be motivated intrinsically, is the ability to use the maximum amount of their talents on the job and be recognized for it. And that's not difficult to do, but a lot of leaders and managers are too lazy to make sure it happens. So if people apply their talents and they're recognized, they're happy. They'll recruit more people. And they don't have to succeed all the time. It's not the success, it's the behavior that's important. But we seem to have missed that. And so we have people, wandering around, wondering what they're going to do next. But I'll tell you something. there's going to be some resolution to this, but we're going to have a hell of a lot of people sleeping in the basement on their parents' couch.
Right. You hit on something. I just want to highlight it real fast. There was a statistic out there. It might be 10 years old now, but I can't believe that it's done a 180. At one point, there was a number floating that said 87% of the people who terminate or leave a job leave due to a feeling of lack of recognition. It is a key skill. There are process behaviors. I think it's a bunch of bull when I hear, oh, they all want more money. I can give you 25 ways to recognize somebody. It has nothing to do with more money. But they're just not being taught how to do this, and the repercussions are staggering.
Well, it's very simple. I worked for a large newspaper at one point, and when I interviewed the staff, they told me that, they were very depressed because every morning, the last edition's headlines and leads would go up there, and the managing editor in red would point out what's wrong with them. The grammar was wrong, the headline was wrong, the spacing was wrong, whatever it was. So I talked to the managing director and I said, has it ever occurred to you to put up positive examples, or is everything rotten here? He said, no, I just put up the bad examples. I said, put up the good examples and mark those in blue. And he did that. It cost the company nothing. It took one day. And suddenly everybody was happy and they'd flock to the board in the morning. They'd see who got rewarded. They said, okay, I got to copy that. And the few red marks, they said, okay, yeah, but he's right about that. We got to improve that. I mean, this is why I make the big bucks.
Right. Well, it's beautiful. At least balance your feedback. And what you were doing was manually getting them to put their feedback in balance a little bit. Sure, I get a lot more credibility if you know that I'm going to recognize the good along with the bad. But balance is key, in my opinion. All right, I can't let you go. Just one last question, but I got to hear about this success trap. What you mean by the success trap and how to keep from falling into it?
Sure. If you sort of picture an S, the letter S, people start a business or an endeavor or a product or a service, and if it's successful, it climbs that first hill. But if you think about the letter S, in the middle, it flattens out. And people get on this plateau. And because of the laws of entropy, all plateaus erode. And the only people I know who coast are people who are going downhill. You don't coast going uphill. You don't coast going level, you coast going downhill. And so the idea here is if you get on that plateau and don't realize it, you're in the success trap. What you have to do is when you get to the top of that S curve, you have to leap to the next S curve. And when you do that, now you're climbing another hill. And so this is why, I claim that growth is important and innovations is essential to growth. You have to keep creating new things and growing, because if you get on that plateau, man, you're in the success trap. And before you know it, you're headed downhill.
Well said. And a great way for us to bring it in for a landing. Sentient strategy, how to create market dominating strategies in turbulent economies. Sounds like a great book. I'm assuming we can get it anywhere, Amazon and the whole shooting gallery, any online or retail store, correct?
Yes. And if you go to my site, which is Alan Weiss, AlanWeiss.com, you'll find a free audio, free video, free text, free newsletters, whatever you like. You're welcome to them.
Well, you took my last little point, which is how do people get a hold of you? And you filled that in beautifully. So give it to me again. How do people get a hold of you?
AlanWeiss.com. And
Beautiful.
you'll find my blogs there and my podcasts and everything else.
Fantastic. Well, Alan, I'm very grateful you came in. Yeah, corrected me in a few areas. I took some notes and I'm going to look those over. So I learned a few things from you today, and I'm grateful. Thanks for coming in. Appreciate it.
Rob, thanks. It was a great time.
You bet. All right, folks, we'll do it again as well as we can next time. Until then, stay safe.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please rate and recommend it on iTunes, Outcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information on this show and Rob at jollis.com.